Okay, so first off, all the photographs that you're going to see are from when I was in Jamaica for my graduate study work. I'm currently in a second graduate program at California State University, Northridge. There's a few of you in the crowd. But this was actually through University of Technology in Jamaica and also Roehampton University in England. But this was my thesis. So I wanted to tell a story first. That's right. Yeah. I wanted to tell a story really quickly. So I met a young woman named Sarah. She was 18 when I met her. And I was meeting her because she was going to be a part of this study. She had been a part of the leading residential program in Jamaica. And she started off her story as to why she was at that facility, saying that she needed to talk about socks. And I questioned her, said, no, it's really important. The socks are really important. And I said, why are socks so important? She said, my stepfather, who had HIV, would stuff socks into my mouth so that I would not scream as he would molest me at night. And that was the first thing that she said when we were talking about why she was at a residential care facility for children with HIV and AIDS in Jamaica. So in that experience, the first thing that she mentions is this. The second thing that she mentions is that she's been on the street for easily the last 7 years. And that's when I had met her. I had met her all the way back in 2009. So she's on the street. She's lucky if she gets about $7 from her father, her biological father. She didn't even realize that she had HIV until she was long into her time with Dare to Care before she had left there and before she had run away from that facility, which is what eventually she did. But her experience at Dare to Care started when her father noticed that when her mother had passed away from HIV, he took her to the hospital thinking that she might also have the same symptoms. And so when she went to the hospital, she didn't know why she was going. She was 7 years old when she was there. She didn't know why her father was crying, her biological father was crying, and all he told her was, you're going to be fine, you're going to be just fine. And then it was shortly thereafter that she went to Dare to Care, which was a residential facility. So I start off with this story because she was one of the first alumni from this program, even though technically she had run away from it. And the experience of actually aging out of residential care with HIV is now one that actually resembles hope, which is a very, very different experience than what Sarah had as she was walking through her life. So very quickly, some background on the study, and I apologize for how small the writing is, but I'll be saying all of it, so you don't necessarily have to read any of it. So the reason why I actually was interested in this study is because I had come across some information from UNAID, UNAIDS in 2008 about how the Caribbean at that time had the second highest rate of HIV prevalence, topped only by sub-Saharan Africa, which may sound pretty crazy considering the fact that the Caribbean only had 22,000 individuals with the virus, specifically in Jamaica. So that seems like a very small number, but in comparison to regions, it was the second highest prevalence rate at that time. 1,700 children were infected with the disease at that point. And many had lost their parents to the virus because many of them had actually gotten it from their parents, or they were abandoned. Many of the children, the parents didn't know what to do once they found out that they had HIV. The parents said, well, how do we take care of this child? They would end up going to a residential facility that was specifically meant for hospice care. They weren't there to actually live, they were there to ultimately pass away, because the fatality rate at that time was 50% for children with HIV. And so residential care facilities, Dare to Care was one of them. They were taking care of 27% of the children infected with HIV. And so there was this massive shift that happened in 2003 when Global Fund and the Clinton HIV/AIDS initiative came into play. All of a sudden, subsidized drugs were available for those who had HIV in 2003, and all of a sudden this major shift happened with the terminal disease becoming a chronic illness. And once that happened, these children that were given this death sentence all of a sudden had a chance at life. And it was this incredible dilemma because all of a sudden they had to shift major structural aspects of their social services. These places that used to be hospice care now all of a sudden had to be transitional homes. And the programs through that had to change all of their services to all of a sudden ask that very, very important question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because they hadn't asked that of these children up until that point. So the rationale for the study actually came about because the University of the West Indies, which is right across the street from the university I was attending, they also house the top researchers of the field in the Caribbean. And they were also the same people that were doing the research were the same people that were giving the medical services to the children at Dare to Care. So they were on the cutting edge of having that ability to be able to access the drugs and to be able to have any access to new endeavors medically. So the West Indian Medical Journal from that university reported on the success of highly active antiretroviral therapy, which is ARVs for treatment of HIV, to reduce childhood morbidity and mortality, and noted that this longer lifespan all of a sudden was providing this opportunity for kids to live long past their life expectancy. And so they also noted that transitional services needed to occur, but they didn't specify any information beyond that. And so my preliminary interviews with individuals from the actual University of West Indies and these researchers and doctors indicated we need research on this, we just don't have it yet, but we know we need to have this. And so I locate myself in the study because it was very weird. I'm not sure if you've had this experience of Kismet where all of a sudden you find yourself in the exact right place at the right time with your research, where you're just, wow, this totally fits with what I've had in my past. So I had worked overseas in Swaziland, which is a small country almost totally surrounded by South Africa, and they have the highest rate of HIV infection right now. When I was there as a relief worker from 2002 to 2003, there were some communities that had a 40% prevalence rate of HIV, 40%. So when I had the chance to work there, it was right at the peak of that prevalence. And then afterwards, I worked at a foster care and adoption agency and residential care facility in the United States. And so I had a chance to see how children were being transitioned out of foster care and residential care. And then I'm a graduate student. I find out about this research and I go, oh my gosh, I have these strange two things that I can pull together and see if I can help. So I was very excited to be a part of it. I also had the chance to intern and to be their photographer and videographer for this agency. And so that's why you see a lot of pictures here. These are all the kids from that. And just so you know, when it comes to privacy issues, all of these were actually picked by the agency for their fundraising campaign. And so I'm not using any that are indicative of what they wouldn't use as a normal aspect of their publicity. But the aim of the study, what I wanted to find out is I wanted to find out the nature and effectiveness of what they do have currently in Jamaica for transitional services, how they're aging out this population, and to identify ways in which it can be improved. And so first off, since there wasn't a lot of literature yet, there's a ton of literature in the United States about emancipation and transitioning youth out of foster care and residential care, but there's not a lot actually in the rest of the world in regards to transitional services or adult preparation services from out-of-home care. And there also was very little that was published yet about the additional transitional needs of youth with HIV and AIDS within residential care facilities. There just wasn't a lot of research on that. And so I wanted to find out those two pieces, merge them together, and to find out through those what were the implied services that were needed, and ultimately how support systems in Jamaica were actually doing something. They weren't not doing anything, they were doing something. I just wanted to find out what else was needed to be able to support this cohort as best as possible. So it's actually a mixed methodology case study. There was qualitative data and quantitative data that was collected. The target population was actually program directors, chief researchers, adolescents from all the leading child welfare agencies within Jamaica. Because of how small the nation is, it was a lot easier to be able to literally call up the Ministry of Family and just go, I would like to talk to you. Okay, just come on over. And you sit down with the head minister of that department and you're like, okay, great, I'll be here for 2 hours. And that was a normal aspect of doing research in Jamaica, was accessibility to so many people that actually could make a difference, which was very exciting. But because I had had these connections in different parts of the world, it behooved me, I felt like, to include Swaziland and the United States, because Swaziland's the least industrialized country, Jamaica being an industrializing country, and then the US being a most industrialized country. I felt like having that global perspective would be able to fill in some of those gaps with the literature that we didn't have. And so 3 formal transitional programs to determine standard needs of kids coming out of foster care and residential care were interviewed, and anyone I could find from those respective agencies. 2 residential programs that specifically served HIV-positive individuals, and then also the actual children and staff at Dare to Care. Just to give you an impression, like these are some of the top agencies that were a part of the study and that were accessible, which was amazing. So really quick, purposeful sampling was done. I needed to make sure I was only getting people specific to that population and to that study, and were data rich. And snowball sampling, once you talk to one person, then the next person you could access, which was great. And I mentioned already the multinational approach. There's over 60 sources ultimately that were involved. Data collection, literature review, semi-structured interviews, questionnaires with semi-open-ended, dichotomous, and multiple choice questions with the actual youth. Both youth that were there, and then of course the alumni that I'd spoken with, and then a review, of course, of the agency's documents. But the needs ultimately came down to, there were sections of needs. You had needs for children coming out of residential care, which were these physical and mental health, making sure that those were affordable, making sure that they could navigate through those. Employment, resumes, knowing how to do that, knowing how to use a computer, knowing how to interview, having affordable housing, safe housing, life skills from like that first load of laundry to actually paying that first bill, knowing how to do that. Education beyond the basics, not just saying, oh, we're just going to make sure they have high school. No, not just secondary. How can we actually pull them into tertiary? There's a lot of focus on sort of like the basics oftentimes. Let's just make sure they get through the system, and it's like, no. How can this actually go to that next step? And then cultural and personal identity formation, just provide that foundation, which is fantastic. Community connections, of course, and mentors and support. But really, without these pieces, the youth coming out of residential care are totally at risk of incarceration, early pregnancy, physical and mental health problems. You've heard these things before, homelessness, you know these things. But with children with HIV, there's an added component to that, a lot of added components. With children that are coming out with HIV, all of a sudden you have an individual that has to all of a sudden become their own caretaker. So imagine a child with HIV every single day at the same exact time, they're given their medication by a caretaker, or a family of caretakers at that residential facility. They're given this pill, they're given this water, they're given that nutritious meal. But when they're on their own, all of a sudden you have them having to navigate not just, they have to actually be listening to their body in regards to how the actual illness is affecting them and how the different drugs are affecting them, because HIV and the treatment for it are not stagnant. And so you're perpetually having to react to a body that's immune system is breaking down, and how do you constantly react to that and to be able to be attuned to that. So you have to make sure you're aware of adverse effects of drugs. And imagine an 18-year-old doing this. Adverse effects of drugs, shifting your medical regimen to be able to appropriately react to different symptoms, or to notice things within your body and to react to them and go to the doctor. How many 18-year-olds would know to do that, and no matter who they are? And also the fact that the progression of the illness, paying attention to that, and always having proper nutrition. Sometimes some of the drugs you can't actually have the drugs without the food. And so if you don't have access to proper meals, you're not going to be able to take your medication. Adherence is extremely important because what they recommend is that you have a 95% adherence rate. That's only missing one pill a month. And normally it's not just one pill that you're taking, but you also have to take it around the same time every day. And so one pill that you miss, how many of you have actually missed, if you have to take a regular medication, how often do you miss your medication? Frequently. Now, for first line of therapy, we have 3 lines of antiretroviral therapy. The first line, if you don't adhere to your medications, you can become resistant to that line, and then you're the next line of therapy. You have to take a totally different bouquet of drugs. And when you take those drugs, if you're not adherent to that, you don't have many options left. You're going to be moving away from this idea that your body is actually going to become drug resistant to everything. The tricky part to that too is that if you have a partner, like you have a serodiscordant partner that doesn't have HIV, and you have that partnership, you have that sexual relationship, which most people do with HIV, they typically continue on with sexual relationships. It's part of life. And so that individual that you potentially give that HIV to, you give them a drug-resistant HIV. So they can't start on the first line. They have to start on whatever line that you're on. And also if you have maybe, both of you have HIV, you think, oh, well, we both have it. It's fine. We can just be together sexually, not worry about it, not use a condom, what have you. But they're not just one strain of HIV. And so you could actually give a super infection. You could actually give your partner another strain of HIV. So there's a lot of these pieces that come into play. Imagine an 18-year-old with everything that's happening hormonally, on top of the medical regimen, on top of what they're doing just to transition out of residential care. There's a lot of pieces that come into this. And so the psychosocial support, huge. Of course, like nausea, fatigue, the standards with regards to a lot of symptoms that we see with a lot of illnesses, those come into play. But there's also lipodystrophy, which is actually something that can happen on a major extreme case with HIV, where your fat actually gets redistributed in your body. Imagine, again, an 18-year-old with that. You have social isolation possible, anger, anxiety, stress of potentially infecting another person, disclosing what you have. There's so many pieces to this. So specialized sexual education is pertinent. It's so critical. And also, of course, anti-discrimination legislation. Jamaica right now, I'll move into that. Actually, I can move into that right now. HIV and AIDS in Jamaica is considered the poor man's disease or the gay disease. Homosexuality and HIV are often still very closely aligned in Jamaica. And so you have this issue with children who have HIV. It's like, oh, poor child. An adult who has HIV, oh, they're the perpetrator. And all of a sudden there's a shift in how they are looked at. And so these different pieces of, like, if you have enough money, people don't need to know that you have HIV. You can skirt away from that. They don't have to actually recognize it. So these different pieces that come into play. Sodomy is still outlawed in Jamaica. And so with that added composure of it, you have different jobs are still allowed to actually not hire you if you have HIV. You can be pushed away from any health care in some cases. They've had, the Human Rights Watch did this wonderful report in 2004 where they had doctors putting on 3-4 gloves to just be able to touch someone who had HIV. And so there's a lot of different factors. You could be kicked out of your home, and there's not any formal anti-discrimination legislation in place right now. It's talked about, it's not in place. So again, imagine all of this happening for a child coming out of residential care. And this was the point of the study. So these are the different pieces. I'm not going to go over them specifically about what Dare to Care had or had not. You're welcome to review them. But there were a lot of missing pieces because they were just starting out. This was back in 2009 that I did this study, 2009, 2010. And so there was a lot of things that we're still figuring out. What's interesting is that I had a chance in 2012 to actually go to Botswana and South Africa and start to talk to them about this. And this is something that they're like, wait a minute, we don't have this yet. How can we actually maybe do some more research in this area to see how we can have it affect us here? These were recommendations back in 2009 for that particular agency. Comprehensive sexual education, transitional housing options, this merging of the two, these two populations. And this was follow-up interviews that I just did back in 2016, where I had a chance to talk with several of the individuals that were part of the original study. And there are so many things to celebrate about what's happening with research with HIV. Specifically with prevention and mother-to-baby transmission is just skyrocketing, and like we have Cuba that has now been able to eradicate that within that country, which is fantastic, and nearly it is to that in Jamaica as well. But they have this thing called, with UNAIDS, called 90-90-90, and it's 90% of a population is supposed to have been tested, 90% of that population is supposed to actually be receiving ARVs, and 90% of that population is supposed to be within a certain viral load. So there's certain millennial goals that they're trying to reach for, and what they've gotten in Jamaica is that first one. They've got people testing, but then they don't have the other two where they're actually taking the medication and they're maintaining the medication, so their viral loads are very low with HIV. And so we have this good stuff up here, concerted effort on transitional services, but there's not really any known understanding as to how those services are playing out, how effective they are. And so the idea that potentially there's room to potentially do another census or to do something in the future with, to find out where those kids are now, what's happening with that population since they've received services that are actually based on some of that work from that previous study. So it begs the question, like, what other countries are actually, what are they doing? There's only 30,000 people right now in Jamaica that have HIV, 30,000 compared to, say, Swaziland, where still it's like 20%, 6% of the population has HIV. So imagine, like, what they're particularly doing with these cohorts of individuals that are coming through the system, and they need to know how to prepare themselves, and the nation needs to be able to know how to welcome them in. So great strides in HIV research globally, as I mentioned, but I think it's really imperative that we come back to this idea of, like, yes, we have this great advances, What we don't want to forget is the fact that there's still kids that are coming out with it. We may be able to prevent it from happening, we may be focusing on vaccines, but then we have these kids that have it right now. And so what do they want to be when they grow up? The children that I talked to, they wanted to be criminal lawyers, they wanted to be researchers, they wanted to be in the military, they wanted to be all of these wonderful different kinds of careers. And one girl stood up to me and she got right in my face and she says, I want to be a prime minister. And so that was fantastic, thank you. And so we need to make sure that we don't lose these youth. The youth that I talked about at the very beginning, Sarah, 3 years ago she passed away on the street. 3 years ago, I mean, she was in her early 20s. And that's what's going to happen if we don't take it seriously. And so that's been my research. And my final week at Dare to Care, there was a young girl that was crying. She was a baby, like nearly a baby. And I ran up to her to help her when I was there. And I took care of her for most of the afternoon, and I was just sitting there with her, and she's a beautiful baby, and she stopped crying as soon as you picked her up, but you had to keep holding her. But she had this big smile, and we just kind of had this wonderful afternoon together, just spending time with each other. And I asked at the very end, because I didn't know her name, and they said, oh, her name is Hope. And for me, it was my last experience at Dare to Care, and it was with a child named Hope. And so moving forward, it's a priority for us to be able to focus on these kids. Those are limitations of the study. I don't have enough time. Future research, though, is expanding this to a broader population, conducting a longitudinal study, which would be fantastic, and actually having a census or survey of outcomes. So that's it.
Okay, so what a wonderful, don't leave.
Oh, sorry.
We'll keep you here. Ashley and Mario and Caroline. Oh, there you are. I was looking for you over here. Maybe you guys can come to the front, and if you want, we can turn these chairs around, maybe. And I'm sure there's some questions and thoughts or follow-ups. So we're gonna just do this kind of informally. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, okay.
Okay. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Ashley, I had a question for you about the couple burnout. In your experience of what you've found so far, have you found it that it's only related to families who are sandwiched, or do you also find couple burnout among parents who are caring for children, maybe children with disabilities or children with severe illnesses?
Yeah, so I think most of the research is I found about either parents caring for children with disabilities or men and women just caring for the elderly. There was very little about couple burnout within the sandwich generation. So far I've kind of just gone off that, but to now, 2017, there's a little bit more, but there's still not a lot. So I think that's what makes me want to expand on it.
Another question for Ashley. You talked about how these women had positive spins on their experience. Can you talk more about what these positive spins were and why they spun it that way?
I think it was very much, this is what I have to do right now in my life. So even though they're caring for their children and their elderly parents, they're in that moment. Yeah, they might have ended their marriage because of it, but I think all of them at the beginning didn't have that point of view of positivity, but they're like, well, we're in it to win it now, so we need to adjust our lives to what's going on. So whether it was, asking for help for 30 minutes to have on their own, that alone time or their homework, it caused them to be a little bit more positive about it. A lot of them had just said, we're in this now, so we might as well make the best of it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just like, well, I'm kind of thinking of like, Anne Swindler wrote a book about love, about love and culture, and how how people put positive spins, how people sometimes explain their own marriages in terms of the positive benefits they get out of it. But then when in a hypothetical situation, if they get negative things out of it and, ask would you leave, they'll say, no, I love them, and things like that. So they've got this rational choice thing on the one hand, but then they reach into their cultural toolkit, as she would say, to like explain away the negative things that can happen. You know what I'm saying? So that's what it reminded me of, is this book called Talk with Love by Anne Swafer.
Yeah, and I think that would come into play as further research on it. This was a very small study compared.
And I'd like to add to that, because that was one of my questions. Why are they rationalizing this, right? Spinning the story. One of the things I found in my own research on caregivers, which are all women as well, there's a small percentage, there's an increasing number of men who are doing caregiving. It's been increasing slowly in the last 15, 20 years, primarily because of the aging, the socio-demographic change. But for women, there is really a moral imperative, to care. We talk about imperatives a lot when it comes to fulfilling role in, whether they're gender role expectations. The women that I've studied really feel this, it's a moral imperative. But what's interesting is that I followed them over the course now of 7 years, and while there is a process to the evolution of that moral imperative, which is at the beginning there is a lot of sort of uneasiness and kind of rejection of it. Then there is this kind of, okay, this is where I'm at, I gotta make sense of it and I gotta do it because that's what being a good woman means. And then at some point, a sort of stage of moral dilemma. Oh, wait a minute. Does it really mean that I have to do this to be a good woman? So there is a questioning of the imperative. And then some sort of different trajectories are along some sort of resolution. Some women, depending on where they fall on that sort of continuum of hegemonic femininity, rejected completely. Other ones adopt it, other ones sort of play with it to negotiate it and reconceptualize it. And actually, in my own work, one of the things that I've been tracking is that who of those, what are the different sort of outcomes in terms of depression or anxiety or distress for the women who follow those different trajectories. And it looks like the women who are able to reconceptualize that sort of notion of hegemonic femininity are the more likely, are the ones that actually end up doing better. But it's a really fascinating area, and it's of such, importance, public health importance, given the aging population. So thank you for continuing to do this work and for sharing it with us here. Any other, more questions? I have more questions for all of them, but I could just talk. Yeah, here.
For Mario, I was thinking about how women are, I guess, now more prevalent in these ads. And I was wondering, do you think it's because they are targeting women through their ads saying, like, your husband is lacking this, this will add something to your life. I was going to use different language that is appropriate. Or do you think it's on, targeting the man saying, like, your wife is missing this from you, don't you want to make her happy, or something else?
Well, I think on an initial view, most would say that they're targeting men. They refer to the men, but Dr. Malkowski, in work that she hopes to do in the future, looks at these ads particularly at how the way these women are speaking are a way that, female partners of men experiencing erectile dysfunction, they can adopt this same sort of language so that they can then talk to their husbands. So it's sort of this teaching tool that they're using so that they can speak to their own husbands.
So one thing I've noticed in a lot of the Viagra ads is a very distinctive racialization, which I didn't see in your in your presentation. So I don't know if you've paid attention to the racial components of who is being in these advertisements. I have never seen a Viagra ad with a person of color in it. It's always a white male or if it is a female, it is a white female and they're in some exotic location, which then speaks to, always, like, it speaks then to their social equality or their socioeconomic status, because then they can afford to take this beautiful woman, which without this pill is out of your league, to this gorgeously exotic location with her matched luggage. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you guys have also considered in your research.
So there is a couple of the ads that actually use black men now more recently.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Only, yeah.
the print advertisements that we aren't really looking at, something that's interesting is that because there's this like weird blue tint to the images, the men are racially ambiguous. Yeah, you can't really tell what their race is. And I mean, it's possible that, because we have these sort of racial conceptions of black men in particular as hypersexual, that
And
could,
Latinos.
yeah, as well for sure. That could potentially play a part, but that was not something we looked super in depth into, because this campaign, while I would say most of the men present are white, there are men of color represented in a few cases.
I also think about how the sort of the racial ethnic issue intersects in this context with class. Because there is a sort of, if you were to sort of impose that class framework on it, there is a certain aspect of the ads that are certainly targeting, as you all have pointed out, well-resourced men.
Sure, yeah. You're
So
not
there is definitely a class aspect of it that, therefore, by implication, suggests, men of color can't afford this, or don't have access to care, or whatever the case might be. So there is I think an interesting intersection there that might explain some of the issue around race and ethnicity. Yeah.
I saw that as aspirational advertising. Like, if you use these feminine products, suddenly you'll know how to ride a horse or surf. Like, just if you use this product, you're gonna find yourself on a sailboat somehow. Like, I mean, advertising is like, there's obviously like class, race, ethnicity components to it, but for the money thing, I always thought it was, look at what you can have if you take our product.
Well, and which is interesting then, because of the way that some blue-collar men are presented in these ads. Like I said, in one it's a construction team, and then in another, like I said, we see farmers and ranchers, and so we're not necessarily only seeing these like elite sort of businessmen, but that then sort of can be seen potentially as this appeal to like the everyman.
Did you look at where they were airing?
That's something that we have not looked at super in depth. It's something we're considering, again, particularly the print advertisements specifically ran in like a golf magazine, which also talks to class and physical ability and stuff like that. But in terms of television stations, I mean, I can make assumptions. You probably would see them on like ESPN and like Primetime and other sort of male target audience networks, but specifically, I can't answer that.
Not so much